Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back there somehow virtually this time, but it's great. So thank you so much, and I hope this it makes for an interesting conversation. As Christoph has mentioned, I finished my PhD. I submitted it in May last year, and I defended it in October 2022. So somehow what I'm going to explain is a bit of the PhD, how I framed it and how I developed it, and what happened around it during the PhD and after it. Trying to make it instrumental for those of you who are researching. So hopefully it will be interesting for you in that respect. So my PhD is entitled, as the previous slide was showing, Collaborative Architecture Barcelona. So it's pretty much situated in the city. And the second title, subtitle, is The Architect as Enabler. So it starts with a pretty much simple observation, which is we are looking at how the discipline of architecture is changing worldwide in different socio-economic contexts, also geographical ones, towards an architecture of collaboration as a response to, let's say, global dynamics, which may include capitalism, lack of affordable resources, lack of legislation in certain cases, and so far and so on, right? So architecture in certain areas becoming a tool for care between communities, which is something that actually we're looking at that as a recent phenomenon, but it's not the case exactly. Already in the 20th century, there are examples in which communities were gaining growing importance over the years as active stakeholders in the project of architecture. So let's say we can oppose that image. In this case, for example, in the right side, Fraiotto discussing with dwellers of his project how the house should be built. We can oppose that, let's say, to the architect as an autonomous mind who's creating, let's say, in an abstract world away from everyday problems, right? As I was mentioning, this is situated. In my case, the research context is in Barcelona, and I sort of argued it's relevant to study this phenomenon in the city because of three different situations. The first one is the 2008 worldwide crisis, the real estate crisis, turned up into some sort of social revolution in 2011, which brought the politicization of overall society and a claim towards social agendas also in architecture. The second one is municipalism. So how these social movements in 2015 got to the government of the city. The person who you see in the image is the same, Ada Colau. On the left-hand side, she was dressed as a superhero for the right to housing. And on the right side is the first time she got to be the mayor of Barcelona in 2015. She's still nowadays. So this brought a very specific historical moment in the city, which is that grassroots movements were not opposed to the institutions, but actually governing them. And of course, this brought a new wave of social movements against the institutions, but that's, let's say, a side comment. And then the third one is that this process over the last decade produced a number of different projects, which became a really effective response from the discipline of architecture to urban problems in which both public and private procurement were not being able to address for different reasons. Thank you, Christoph. This, as part of the observation, this led to the emergence of new tools for architects. Architects were still designing, but they were doing somehow differently. On the left-hand side, Lacol architects in a workshop with dwellers not that far from the image that we were looking at of Fraiotto. On the hand right side, Arquitectos de Cabecera, which is the practice that Christoph was mentioning, could be translated as community architects or GP architects or family architects. In 2015, we set a free architecture office aiming architecture to be a social service open for everyone who would need that, right? Of course, there's then all the theoretical research that I developed, many publications that have appeared, and I think also recently this has gained some importance. And as the historical one, there's Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, which pretty much classified social engagement in a ladder that you can see on the right-hand side, depending on the power relation pretty much of the different stakeholders. So on the one hand, below we would have the manipulation of citizens by the institutions or by power, and on top of that, as opposed to citizen control, which is something that has been discussed over the years, you see 50 years now, more or less, by many, many different authors, right? So this was my context. Then question myself, how would I position myself as a research within this? So I identified the shift in the discipline of architecture at 3 different levels. On the one hand, the architectural practices, shifting from traditional studios to collectives and sometimes cooperatives of architects. So from the main practitioner, let's say Corbusier, one name, but then he had 20, 30 people drafting at his studio, a complete shift in this understanding of the figure of the architect towards a collective. Then the production process, including new roles, the one of the enabler, and new design methods, and finally the outcomes. What did this produce as a result? So the aim was pretty clear in this case, right? What's the impact of a collaborative process in architecture within and beyond the discipline? So to do that and to be able to frame my research, I developed this mind map, which I hope it's going to be helpful for you, which is pretty much the mind map of my entire research. So all the PhD that I developed can be explained with one single drawing. On the one hand, what I just explained, the context and the disciplinary shift, the aim and objectives of the thesis, and then the different lines of inquiry, which are, again, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the 3 different ones that I just explained, right? The organization of the office, the production process, and the outcomes, followed by a number of research questions and specific methods to each of these questions. So I realized that I needed different methods in order to gain the data, in order to respond. For example, what were the new aims and goals, which were the new professional roles, on which were both the constructed outcomes and the non-spatial outcomes of the research, right? And finally, the contribution to knowledge, didn't mention that, but I developed a PhD by practice. So I wanted to have an impact both to the theory of architecture, in this case, an analysis of the practice and analysis on the impact, but also to practice itself. So it emerged the idea of developing a toolkit for collaborative architecture, which could be both a form of analysis and an instrument for practice. So very briefly, these are like the 4 methods: theoretical research, more or less what I explained. And then on the one hand, qualitative research. These are interviews that I developed according to different case studies in which I pointed out at conflictive case studies. So urban struggle and what was the role of architects, how they position themselves in that struggle. Then practice-based, as I mentioned, this is part of Arquitectos de Cabecera, where we engage with different community projects. So I developed that as part of the research, and to me it was essential to understand how these practices operated from within. And to me, that was a knowledge that could only be gained through hands-on practice. Also, as a designer from the office, this is a project that, if I have time, I can explain very briefly. But that's a cooperative housing project that we developed in the city, applying some of the tools developed from the PhD and testing them in practice with a real community to design a building that eventually won an architecture competition. So it was a way to test whether the hypotheses were working or not. And finally, participatory action research, which was about testing all these tools with different architects collectives at the School of Architecture as well, and asking them whether they operated in a certain way, but articulated through the toolkit that now I'm going to show, right? So pretty much that's, to me, one of the main contributions of the PhD, which is this toolkit that I mentioned. That's the one that I submitted as part of the PhD. And pretty much it emerged at a moment in which I realized I lacked the tools to analyze collaborative practices in architecture, because quite often those practices are either described from a theoretical point of view or sometimes even from sociology. But what is somehow hidden is the tools employed to make these decisions and the material that they produced. So everyone knows, for example, the pictures of La Borda as a cooperative housing building, quite well known, that is finished, but it's not that known the architectural thinking that brought to that outcome. So I was much more interested in the process of decision making in a collaborative manner than actually the spatial outcome of it, even though it was important as well, right? So what you see in the screen, it's that toolkit that aim to classify all these different tools that architects employed in a taxonomical manner, in a way that could serve as a part of the analysis for the PhD, right? So on the one hand, I argued that this was a way of enabling a reflection on practice, an instrument to analyze that, and then finally to inform practice, because this toolkit went back to the architecture offices that were part of it. These are the different sheets, as you can see. So it was tried to be very analytical in a way that it had a code, a title, the description, and then a few examples, each of them. And then at this point, I decided to organize it by project phases, even though it's quite limiting or traditional, maybe in a not very nice sense. But it was absolutely useful in order to identify the different tools that were incorporated in specific moments. And this produces a change. So it's not the same to, for example, engage with dwellers when you're planning, when you're doing what typically is called participative process, which it's a term that I'm against that because I find it absolutely problematic. But that would be, for example, looking at what are the needs, then the strategy phase, design, or even execution, right? So these are the different codes and the different tools that were organized. And then I cross that with Arnstein ladder, which you can see here. So on top, we have user-driven. Below, we have professionals, pretty much, in the different phases. So management, data gathering, and the drawing of this data, cartography, analysis and design of the project, design, execution, and post-occupancy. So this allowed me to understand that certain projects are not community-led or are not publicly led, but are somehow a mix between them in which projects could jump from one row to the other one in an understanding that actually overcomes these ideas from top-down and bottom-up, which became very limiting in order to describe the case studies. So also to explain you a little bit the process of the PhD, understanding that this may be of your interest, this is the evolution of it. So the first version, which was from May 21 till the submission, which is May 22. So the first 3 years of the PhD, this was somehow in the back of the mind drafted, but it really got developed in depth for the last year, in which what you see here is the evolution of the content. So each of these are the different tools. This is to understand how they changed from one chapter to the other, meaning phase of the project to another one, new tools that emerge and tools that actually didn't have sense to be there, or two tools were joined in a single one. So this became really an evolutive process as long as the project was being developed, and it gained complexity over time. And that's what's going to happen next, which, as Christophe has mentioned as well, that's being developed into a book that hopefully will be published in April. We're really pushing for that. But anyway, to me, it was important that what I developed as a PhD research could have an impact beyond academia in practice, right? So this toolkit was already being, let's say, done with the idea that someday this could raise an interest beyond research itself, although I hope this is employed at some point also by other researchers. How I am on time, Christophe? Hello?
Sorry. Well, you are on time. It's perfect. If you want to share a bit more, please go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you. So just very briefly, this is a little bit an input from the topic of cooperative housing in Barcelona. These are the building permits in Spain. So it totally collapsed in 2008. That's to explain also the collapse of traditional forms of understanding the household. So we see that typically we still design houses for mom, dad, and 2 children. But actually, when we read the news, the people that is living in the flats of the city, because Barcelona is a city of flats, not actually of single-family houses, it's quite different from what still is being what is still being produced. So somehow cooperative housing is becoming a response to the housing crisis that we suffered, or somehow still suffering, and the lack of affordable housing, especially for young people. In a moment, you see Ada Colau here again, in a moment in which public procurement is not being able to develop enough affordable housing, and arguably not even targeting the problem of housing in the right way. So the story of cooperative housing in Barcelona is very recent, although some other countries, Scandinavia, Uruguay, Switzerland, so far and so on, have a very long history. Barcelona is quite recent. These are the two first prototypes. On the left-hand side, La Borda, new building. On the right side, Carrer Princesa, which was a refurbishment. So as a prototype, those buildings allowed dwellers to take control over the process. So of course, this meant that architects automatically had to take a different role in developing that. Which, for example, in this case, you can see dwellers discussing here at the very beginning of the project, the dwellers discussing how the plan or the furniture should be in this case, dwellers actually building or partially building some parts of it. Self-construction is not very popular in Spain because it's being prevented by regulation. But anyway, they managed to build common areas of the building and then dwellers living in it, right? So the interesting bit to me of these four images is that the people that we see in the four of them are the same people. So it's the opposed as a key delivery kind of dwelling provision, be this public housing or houses that one would buy or sell. But actually, this is part of an ongoing conversation. And this allowed, for example, in the case of La Borda, that if a conventional project has housing spaces and common areas, to introduce community areas. So there was an explicit decision of dwellers to have smaller flats, to have more community areas, because the amount of money and the surface that you may build is already limited, right? So they gained all these areas, understanding that this could be an extension of the house outside, let's say, of the privative dwelling. Which is something that was already tested. So, for example, in this case, the individual living cell, the minimum space by Teige back in the 30s. But the big difference is that in the case of cooperative housing, dwellers are the ones deciding that. So somehow it could be argued that this idea back in Soviet Union in the 30s, actually, it didn't work very well because users were dealt as passive receivers of public policies. And cooperative housing is actually understanding them as proactive, as adults or adult citizens capable of taking their own decisions. And this was crossed with the different needs. So not producing housing units or dwelling units anymore for mom, dad, and two children, but actually in this case, you see there's a system of certain variations of the plan that could allow for flexibility, right? So three different sizes of typologies, not defining the household, defining strictly the size of it. And then, as you can see, that's the first floor plan, for example, in which that's the community space, that's the very well-known courtyard, the access to Can Bayo, which is here, and then dwellings. And then this leads to a very, I would say, exceptional image, an exceptional building, which you can see the greenhouse, then these are the dwellings, these are the guest rooms, shared space, the laundry is back here, bicycles and entrance here. So there's a typological, material, and social engagement experimentation that could not be produced in both public and private procurement precisely because dwellers were not part of this conversation. So this continued. Then there was in 2017 competitions for different plots, and in 2020, that's the building that I mentioned before. We won that one, which just very briefly, it's organized about a number of community spaces or shared spaces. In this case, for example, that's the rooftop as the most privileged space of the building. That should be the one that should have access for the entire community. And then a promotion of shared areas and community spaces precisely fostered by dwellers. In this case, one could access the living units through the street in the air, which is, again, an idea that has been repeated over and over. But those of you, for example, who visited the Robin Hood Gardens before its demolition, those corridors didn't actually work very well. And this leads, I think, to the conclusion that if we don't engage with dwellers, the space may fail, because as architects, we cannot design spaces not considering how the space will be used and by whom, right? So in this case, for example, it pushed the idea of flexible household a little bit more. In this case, the dwellings could be able to increase and decrease over time, and this is because the property is single for the entire building. So that's what we delivered to the cooperative, asking them to just set the limits of the house. One can read already kind of an Abraken floor plan here. And then this could allow from different typologies to emerge. So for example, these are nuclear flats, these are cluster living, and this is extended housing. And just very briefly, I'm going to explain you how that related to the PhD. You can see some images, workshops with the community. But then I think, just to conclude, that's what I wanted to show. That's the moment in which the research of the PhD applied to the use case studies. So what you see here are the different codes of the tools that allowed La Borda to exist as a building, right? So these are the specific tools that both architects and dwellers employed throughout the process that were analyzed in this sheet that I showed before. And to me, it was important to understand the process of decision-making architecture. So who takes decisions, whose responsibility it is, and who also benefits from that, right? So I just like developed this analysis for 25 different projects, which included facilities, refurbishment, housing, heritage buildings. And as conclusion, actually, I realized that this process of collaboration does not depend on a specific kind of project, like could be, for example, cooperative housing, but it's more a will of the promoter and the society, and of course, architects to engage with this process.